All right, we'll see if my computer holds up. I have 24% left. This is good, with no power cord. So, welcome. This is the fourth and final in the track for social enterprise. So, those of you who have been with us the whole time, is there anybody here that's been with us the whole day? Wow, you are brave people. Way to go. We began by defining social enterprise. This is a for-profit structure, sustainable structure. It's all about people and planet and profit, because when there's no margin, there's no mission. A social entrepreneur is one who pursues value, and a social entrepreneur is one who pursues social value in a way that's transparent, that involves bold action, that has a target mission, but an enterprise model to get to that target mission. Now, I'm grossly summarizing from all the content of the morning. And just like the axiom, no margin, no mission, well, we would also say, melt down the entrepreneur, melt down the business, melt down the mission. How do you sustain yourself through the difficulties of a mission that has faulty, broken human beings, human systems, and human culture at its core? We know that business itself is hard enough when you add the complexities of a social goal and a social mission inside of a broken system. You know that the stresses and the strains on even the most passionate people take their toll. How do we help those who take on the project of building Shalom, which is the essential project of social enterprise, the flourishing of individuals, the flourishing of communities? How do we help those who take on that project through sustain themselves in that project as well? So that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. And we've already talked a little bit about what a social entrepreneur is, one who takes on the mission of creating and sustaining social value through innovative enterprise, bold action with transparency and accountability to the social fabric and to the planet. I think we can apply that definition of social enterprise in general to social entrepreneurs themselves, actually. Social entrepreneurs are people. They need shalom. They need to be healthy. They live in broken systems. They themselves are the broken. We talked about how the embedded model of social enterprise, where the activity is the mission, is often born of the passion and sometimes the pain of somebody who came from the very problem they're trying to solve. It's the victim of human trafficking who now runs an anti-human trafficking organization that uses enterprise as its core model. Right? They themselves are broken. And in fact, that's all of us. We just have different versions of brokenness. Jesus' most critical remarks of the leaders in his day were of those who thought they weren't broken, who couldn't admit their own brokenness. So we think this works for the social entrepreneur, not just the mission. The mission in the life of the entrepreneur is shalom. We define shalom as making things the way they ought to be. Mennonite scholar Perry Yoder looked at every occasion where shalom was used in the Old Testament, and he found it falls within one of three categories. Making things the way they ought to be in people, that they should be upright, people of the truth, not people of the lie, that they should be integrated, not disintegrating. That there should be shalom for people, that they should have enough, that they should have housing and food and safety and security and abundance, and that there should be shalom between people and God themselves, each other, and the environment. We have to be sure what our foundation is when we engage in social enterprise. I'm not saying that social enterprise is only for people of faith. That's my category as a person of faith. Social enterprise is broadly accepted and is being implemented creatively all around the world, both in Christian and non-Christian traditions and no faith traditions, because the principles of social enterprise work. What I am saying is, from a faith perspective, I know why this works, because I believe God made us a certain way. And the way He's made us is to be in right relationship with ourselves, with Him, with others, and with our environment. That's the human flourishing that He intended. So the project of our enterprises is shalom, but it's also shalom in our own lives, making things the way they ought to be. We talked earlier about how this idea of enterprise is inspired by Genesis, where God brought order out of chaos, creating so others can share in the good, engaging in risk for the potential reward, for the goal of the new humanity, and how social entrepreneurs have similar goals to this. And so Keller sees enterprise as anchored in God's ways. Karl Rahner, the Catholic theologian, this morning we shared how he sees the Father's providential mission being very similar to what social entrepreneurs have to do when they see ahead. Providence, made up two Latin roots, pro and vide, to see ahead. And this is what we have to do so that we understand what the markets are doing, what the landscape is doing, what our context is doing. And somehow we bring that before ourselves as we decide what model to take and how to engage. The Son's self-sacrifice, the Spirit's creativity, and Rahner says this roots this tradition in God's identity, not just His action. We shared this morning about St. Basil, the 4th century patron saint of social enterprise, who, though he was rich, his parents were wealthy. When he converted to Christianity in Cappadocia, modern-day Turkey, he started giving his money away, but he realized the money was going to run out and the poor would still be there. So he changed his model and went with an enterprise model and had all of his monks learn blacksmithing and carpentry and other trades to support hospitals and orphanages and rehab centers. I'm saying all of these things. I know I touched on them before, but I want us to remember that when we're thinking about the spirituality of entrepreneurship and the entrepreneur, there are good, solid biblical foundations and historical foundations for creating a sustainable spirituality that will carry you through a very difficult landscape. But I want to go a little bit deeper. And to do that, I just realized I'm going to need a Bible. We won't spend time or break you up into Bible study per se. But I want you to understand how one faith perspective influences this idea of kind of a spiritual foundation that can carry people. So there's a really interesting story in 2 Kings chapter 4. Let me take you through it. And it describes kind of a typical thing happening in this, what some might regard as prehistory in this part of the world. Now the wife of a member of the company of prophets cried to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead." Now Elisha is this prophet, very well-known religious figure in that era. "He's dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, but a creditor has come to take my 2 children as slaves." Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" Interesting question, right? What shall I do for you? Elisha didn't say, "Oh, I know what your problem is. Look, I've faced this before. Here's what you need to do." No, he let this woman define her own problem. She has agency. She's capable of doing that. What do you need? What's the issue? And then secondly, the second question, what kind of question is that? What do you have in the house? She's got creditors coming to take her children as slaves, and you're asking me what I have in my house. This question, sociologists would say, is an asset-based question. John McKnight kind of the guru of asset-based community development, would say, this is an asset-based question. He is not going to check off all the problems in the woman's life. This is not his approach. And so often this is what we do. We go into neighborhoods, we say, what's the teen pregnancy rate here? We say, how many people here are unemployed? We say, you have a problem with dogs in the neighborhood running around? What about gangs and gang violence? What about domestic violence? And we have this whole checklist of the ills of a community. Meanwhile, we never ask about the grandmother who lives on that corner who cooks for 10 kids in the neighborhood. We never hear about the teacher that stays after school every day and runs her own little informal reading club for the kids who are struggling. We never hear about that person. So this is an asset-based approach. And he says, what do you have in the house? And basically she starts by saying, I don't have anything in the house. Oh, well, I have this jar of oil, right? Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil. He said, go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels, and not just a few. Then go in and shut the door behind you and your children and start pouring into all these vessels. When each is full, set it aside. So she left him and shut the door behind her and her children, and they kept bringing vessels to her, and she kept pouring. When the vessels were full, she said to her son, bring me another vessel, but he said to her, there are no more. Then the oil stopped flowing. She came and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and the rest of your children can live on the rest. Now this mirrors the feeding of the 5,000, a remarkable multiplication of meager resources. Remember 5 fish and 2 loaves, or 2 fish and 5 loaves? I can never remember that. Right, this mirrors that. But who are the players in this story? Well, you got the creditors, you must pay the rent. I can't pay the rent. You must pay. Right. You've got the children, the members of the family, and they're active in this process. You've got the woman. You've got Elisha, the leader. Who else in the story? You got the neighbors. We always forget those. And oh yeah, God. Right? So what do we have here? We have human assets, talents of particular people, material assets. She doesn't have any, but her neighbors have some. So all of a sudden the neighbors are part of the solution? The neighbors are part of the solution. We got Elisha's leadership. We've got the woman's agency. We've got the miraculous that God supplies. The multiplication of the oil, right? Wow, that's a lot of people part of this solution here. And that's an interesting part of the story. But this final phrase is fascinating to scholars. They look at this final phrase and they say, oh great, so she'll pay her debts, live on the rest until it runs out, and then she'll be in exactly the same position as before, right? Now some scholars say actually what Elisha did was set her up here with a little cottage industry. Mm-hmm. It's very likely she's now the oil supplier for that village. All she has to do is reinvest her profits. This is an enterprise solution to a social problem with women who had absolutely no recourse in that era. And her children would have been sold into slavery. This is a good example of how enterprise solved a social dilemma and a situation that had no justice as part of it, how enterprise became the way to justice. We need to understand how deeply rooted this tradition is in the scriptures. I'm so sorry, I keep forgetting to forward both systems here. He addressed a social problem, he utilized current assets, he involved a community, there was human energy and God's intervention, and there was long-term sustainable solution to this situation. And so how can we sustain ourselves for the journey? How can we avoid gaining the world but losing our souls? How do we overcome discouragement or bitterness? In social enterprise, in addition to the normal strains inherent in running a business, we add social mission. And it's not just our job. We care about it. We wouldn't be in it if we didn't. But it can take over our lives. It can seem like a never-ending job. It can dominate our souls. And so we have to ask ourselves these questions. I've had to ask myself this question. I shared at the end of the last session how our absolutely finest, our best model just closed last week or last month. What happens when it falls apart? This is Carolyn. She had everything. She had the knowledge, the skill set, the drive. She had a husband who was a CPA. Her product was top notch. She did everything right. She had a social media strategy. She contracted that out so it was done super professionally, and she was frugal. I mean, it's just, and she pastored and mothered all of the people coming out of rehab that she was working for her. If she failed, it's like we all looked at each other in my office and thought, oh my gosh, what are the odds for the rest of our enterprises that we've invested so much in? So why can Carolyn smile? Well, it's because she thinks this is God's thing. This wasn't her thing. It's because she's a true entrepreneur. Because in her idea, the word faith is spelled R-I-S-K. And if you're not experiencing risk, you're not exercising faith. She still believes in social enterprise. She's not done. Her worth was not wrapped up in success of her business. And all of her hard-to-hire employees, guess what? They got employment elsewhere because of their experience with her. This was a business failure, but this is not a failure. This was a beautiful experiment. It was proof of concept. This works. I mean, yeah, businesses are going to fail. Do you know 3 out of 4 businesses, every business in America, 3 out of 4 fail? Doesn't it stand to reason that social enterprises are going to fail too? It's all part of the experimental process. She lost money, but she did not lose her soul. And she's a hero to me. Let me take you to another identity in the scriptures. This is Lydia from the New Testament, from the book of Acts. As you know, Paul is on this journey to a lot of different cities. And in Acts, I won't take time to read the whole passage, but let me take you from 12 to 15 anyway in Acts chapter 16. From there, we went to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in the city for some days. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate by the river where we supposed there was a place of prayer, and we sat down and spoke to the women who had gathered there. A certain woman named Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira and a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. When she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you've judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my home." And she prevailed upon us. It's an interesting story in the middle of a longer story in that city, but let me call attention to a couple of things. She's originally from Thyatira, a large industrial city and a leading exporter of purple dye. Lydia was now in Philippi, which is a Roman colony on a busy trade route. Merchandise in purple was a commodity for the rich, and most speculate Lydia was upper middle class. She owns a household large enough to provide hospitality to Paul, and from her we get some clues that I think are relevant, that may help us as we seek to sustain our social business journey. Number one clue, she stopped her work regularly for Sabbath. Her pagan neighbors would not do that, and that put her at a competitive disadvantage, but it was her practice nevertheless. Obedience and principle outweigh conventional wisdom sometimes. There are all sorts of Christian-owned businesses across the country that close on Sundays to the chagrin of many people. But they do it out of their conviction. She gathered with other like-minded people. This, I think, is a testament to the importance of an ecosystem in a city. She gathered in a place of beauty, the riverside, connecting to the power of God. She sought God, according to this passage, making room for a spiritual quest. So here we have a business woman with spiritual disciplines built into her life that keep her connected to the source of her conviction and the source of her existence. I think it's really important to see those basic disciplines. She stopped, she gathered, she took in beauty, and she sought God. Take you to another model. Matthew chapter 20 from the Gospels, the parable of the generous landowner. Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 6. For the kingdom of heaven, this is a story Jesus is telling, is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them to his vineyard. So this is a labor story for all of you involved in labor disputes and labor issues, HR, this is a story for you. After agreeing with the laborers for the daily wage, he sent them to the vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I'll pay you whatever's right." So they went. When he went out again about noon, and about 3 o'clock he did the same, and about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." And he said to them, "You also go out into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers in, give them their pay, beginning with the last and going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you've paid them equally to us, who've borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give this last the same as I give you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose to do with what belongs to me? Are you envious because I'm generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." In this story, the landowner does his own farm labor contracting, and he hires men at different times of the day. But at the end of the day, he pays them the same amount. Some of them grumble. And he says, "Hey, it's my money. If I want to be generous, I can be generous." And really, this is a story about the generosity of the landowner, and by virtue of the fact that it's a story Jesus is telling, the generosity of God. But Jesus is using this economic metaphor to teach about God's generosity and grace. But I see additional lessons embedded in the story for what are relevant for social enterprises. And the first is this: be clear about what you value most. The landowner valued the laborer. How many times have you heard company executives say, "The most valuable thing in my company are the people who work for me"? Good owners really get that message, that your most valuable commodity is your employee. This landowner got it. Perhaps he knew that an investment in them was an investment in the health of the larger system. This is what the company Nature Suite does. They define the purpose of, it's a tomato growing organization basically. They define the reason that they're in business is for the health of their workers. That's what they've decided is their mission. And they organize everything around the health of that system. The work of the landowner includes the welfare of the worker. His role is to match talent with need. It's what he does. And there's a price tag to idleness that's unacceptable to the owner. It does something to him to see capable men not employing the talent that they have. He knows the result of them being idle. He knows that that is so bad for the human spirit, as Bob was sharing earlier this morning. We're designed to work, and when it doesn't happen, everyone suffers. And so maybe in tough times, he invests more in his employees to stabilize the economy of the community, because you can imagine what massive unemployment in his system would do to all the other forms of commerce that have to happen when there's no salary being paid. So he's going to find a way to stabilize that economic system. The outcome of idleness is less desirable than even a lowered return on investment, and so he acts in that way. These are small examples from the scriptures that speak to the things that are part and parcel of those involved in social entrepreneurship. And let me take you to a final example, which comes from Matthew chapter 25. This is the parable of the talents, verses 14 and following. For Jesus is telling another story. It's if a man going on a journey summons his slaves and entrusts his property to them. So last one was a labor story. This is really a property management story, right? Or something like that. To one he gave 5 talents, the other 2, to another 1, each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. The same way, the one who had 2 talents had made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of these slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more, saying, Master, you've handed over to me 5, see, I've made 5 more. His master said to him, well done, good and worthy slave. You've been trustworthy in a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter the joy of your master. The one with the 2 talents came forward. Basically, they say the same thing. I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter the joy of your master. Verse 24, then the one who had received the 1 talent came forward. Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what's yours. But the master replied, you wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received at least what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10. For those who have, more will be given, and they'll have in abundance. But for those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. So in this parable, he gives varying degrees of investment to his employees with the intent that they leverage it for gain. The first 2 do, doubling the investment. The third was afraid of the master, dug a hole, thinking, at least I won't lose it. And the master was pleased that the first 2 engaged in risk, but furious that the third didn't at least put it in the bank and collect interest. It's interesting to me that the inference here is that the master would at least not have punished him for that action. Wouldn't have been great, but there's not much commentary here on how much they all received. The master didn't comment. He just saw that they tried and they were successful at trading. Really, the emphasis is not on the amount. It's really on the act of trying. And you knew what kind of man I was and should have acted accordingly. But the fact the man really didn't know the master. He only knew enough to be afraid. He didn't know enough to actually carry out the values of the master, what kind the master was. And so we should ask, do we know our God well enough to know what he would do, what he would sanction, what he would say, what ticks him off, what pleases him? Because as we engage in enterprise, we're faced with hosts of decisions. Those decisions have to be consistent with our core of values, with the center of value that we create. Those values will both carry us in difficult times, but they'll center us when you're faced with confusing options. Options that either do or do not reflect the master that we serve. So this is a challenge to those of us who would enter a realm of seeing enterprise as a way to accomplish social good. And it challenges the question of whether the means justify the ends. Right? That age-old adage, well, at least I'm producing a good outcome. No, the methodologies we use actually matter. Do the methodologies please the one that we're seeking to please? We need to know that master. I think if we had more time, I would be able to read all of these scriptures to you. But this scripture speaks powerfully about how it is God who gives us the ability to produce wealth. That we do all of the work, but we should carry none of the weight. That there was no shame in Carolyn in Tree of Life when it failed. There was no shame. When we go to a city and say we're going to produce profit over there, we should always preface it with, if the Lord wills. Do we believe that God will be the Lord over metrics, over suppliers, over vendors, over landlords, employees, changing markets, outcomes? Do we believe it is God who gives us the power to produce wealth? Those who enter the social enterprise realm know that they are not in this by their own human wiles. that it's an exceedingly difficult road. And yet we have all these enterprises that seem to be beating the national average. So for some reason it works. Well, we think that there's a good reason for that. Characteristics of the entrepreneur. This is a famous passage. Some of you know this passage. Proverbs 31 is often used to talk about the worthy woman. And I like that. Certainly she's a worthy woman. But so often we escape the reflection that's relevant for the forms of commerce that she engages in and the kinds of entrepreneurship that she represents. And so let me just read at length this passage describing what I think are the characteristics of an entrepreneur. Starting at verse 13. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. What's she going to do with that wool and flax? She's weaving something to sell. She's like ships of the merchant. She brings her food from far away. She rises while it's still night and provides food for her household and tasks for her servant girl. She considers a field and buys it. So now she's a real estate speculator. With the fruit of her hand, she plants a vineyard. Now she's a farmer. She girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Oh, she's a buyer. She's a sales rep. She knows the market. Her lamp does not go out at night. She's working hard. She puts her hands to the distaff and her hands to hold the spindle. She's a weaver. She opens her hands to the poor. She reaches out her hands to the needy. She's not afraid for her household when it snows. All her household are clothed in crimson. She makes herself coverings. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the city gates, taking a seat among the elders. She makes linen garments and sells them. She supplies the merchant with sashes. Strength and dignity are her clothing. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household, does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her happy, her husband too, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her a share in the fruit of her hands. Let her works praise her in the city gates. Makes me want to cry when I read that. Where do you see yourself on this list? This woman has taken initiative. She's disciplined. She's an organizer. She's risking. She's a worker. She's strong. She sees value. She knows the market. She's tireless. She's generous. Takes care of herself. Diversifies. She's confident about the future. She trusts in God. She's worthy. I'm asking you too, man. Do you see some of her qualities in you? Because this is the essence of entrepreneurship. Somebody who sees their life as a vessel that is not just to be spent on themselves, but spent in behalf of this larger goal, the flourishing of all we touch. The human flourishing that God has intended for us. And if you wake up every day and that is the mission that you see, you'll sustain for the long haul. This woman wakes up with stuff on her mind. She knows what she's about. She's confident in who she is. Yeah, this is the essence of what it takes to sustain a life of entrepreneurship and to be a social entrepreneur. If anything on this list resonates with you, I really encourage you to write that down, because I think that might be a glimpse into your soul. And if there's anything on this list that you just think, holy smokes, that's not me, then you just got to start asking yourself, okay, I might need someone like that on a team that I put together so that we might be able to try this little tiny model, this little chocolate company that I'd like to put together for the kids in this neighborhood, this little landscaping company that maybe we could get some guys that we know that have just gotten out of prison to do. I mean, the opportunities are endless. We've tried 43 different models, close to 28 of them are operating. They're as diverse as they can be, and I couldn't have dreamt very many of them up. but the people in those circumstances dreamt them up. And they represent a lot of those things on that list. And the ones that they don't have, they found people to weigh in, bringing those gifts as well. This is Sandra Kay. For 25 years, she has loved and served homeless women in Fresno, California, my city. She does this by baking dog treats. The name of the product is Dogs Dig 'em. You should Google it. Dogs Dig 'em. She has women, one of her friends, homeless friends here, she has women come to a commercial kitchen run by a local university. She doesn't even own the kitchen they use. And for 25 years, about 15 homeless women, different, obviously, for those years, bake alongside Sandra. And you know what she's doing while they're baking? She's talking, sharing stories, laughing, loving. And these women find healing in this process. And then they bag them up and they sell them in a whole bunch of grocery stores, and it funds the St. Francis Homelessness Project. 25 years, that's the part I want you to get. 25 years. She's found a way to sustain her momentum. And her Catholic community comes around her, and they provide support and encouragement. The bishop comes and kind of lifts up her story. And it's a modest business. But for 25 years, 15 women a year, that's no small thing, especially in the lives of those women. I think I'm going to quit there. We have a little time, and it might be you want to talk with your neighbor right now. We'll take a few minutes. Maybe there's a question on this list that captures your imagination. Where do you see yourself on the list of characteristics from the woman of Proverbs 31? What resonates with who you know yourself to be? What characteristics are clearly not you? How will you fill in the gaps? From the parable of the wealthy landowner, are you clear on what you value most? Are you aware of what the master is like? Do you have the spiritual disciplines of Lydia? What would it take to adopt? These are just some discussion starters. If there's a question anywhere, you don't have to go in order, but if you would now, just take a moment with someone near you and just find a question to share and interact over that for a few minutes, and I'll bring us back together as we end. Okay, I'm going to bring you back. So I just want to finish with one more slide to encourage you. I call this slide Fresno Faith. These are average people. You can see there are a lot of young people here, some older people. But these are just people who had a sense that someone they knew or some sector in their city of Fresno was not the way that God intended it. That it was out of balance with God's intent, that it was not flourishing, that there were people that were being cut out, that there were people not experiencing bounty, peace, provision, and that maybe with their connections and their vision and even a small amount of resources, they could do something about that. You know, there's Carolyn that tried Tree of Life. There's Eddie that runs a event center with young fatherless men in a rural community right outside Fresno. There's AP that took $18,000 from a church and now runs a $1.7 million a year thrift store that trains 42 or 43 welfare to work people every year. Here's Brian of Lana Coffee. Here's Vicky of Cornerstone Coffee. Here's Gina that runs the Haitian Bead Project. Haitian women in the earthquake zone make these beautiful recycled paper beads, and she sells them in the States. Here's Monisha, who created a branding agency for young men and women of color. Here's Sandra Kay. Here's Lauren, the church leader that started 3 small businesses at his church because people kept coming up to him saying, "Pastor, can you help me find a job?" And they were in no way ready to be employed. He had to have a strategy. He couldn't just keep referring them. You see what I'm saying? It's just small stuff that was the impetus that said there's got to be a different way because the system itself is not working. There's got to be a different way that I, with my connections, my resources, my faith community, my business, my equipment, there's got to be a way I can put those things in service of actually making a difference when the system isn't working. Assets that suddenly became available to them that they didn't know they could use. And they said, oh, that's kind of an opportunity right there. They were just ready and willing to go down that road. Did they know how to run a business before they started their businesses? Heck no. None of them did. None of them did. But they are part of the social enterprise landscape, and these are just a few that's growing in our city. And so this is not a grand strategy and scheme, folks. I'm here raw, real-time telling you this is, after 7 years, this is kind of where we are. And no master person pulling the strings, with this prophetic vision of what it was all going to be like 7 years later was designing it. This is like that commercial you see sometimes with people building the plane as they fly the plane. Have you ever seen that commercial? That's what this feels like. So it's been super important. All of these people have this centering spiritual commitment that gives them the vision to keep going and that connects them to other people of faith who will keep them accountable, centered, and help them in the process. Not a solitary deal. None of these people are lone entrepreneurs out there shining in front of everybody like shooting stars. None of them are. They're as average can be. And I hope you take some hope from that. Whether you feel called to go down this road or not, you're just learning about it, I'll bet you're connected to someone who has an idea. And what would it be like to fan that into flame and to be of support and to connect them? What's your crazy quilt? What could you be? What patch are you in their crazy quilt as they're putting together what they're going to need to make a difference as a social enterprise? Thank you for sticking with us, all those of you who've suffered through all 4 of my seminars today. And if you have questions, please do use the Slido app and say this one's for Randy, and then maybe it'll make it onto the podium and they'll answer it in the panel. I'm always happy to interact with you. If you want the PowerPoints, ask True Charity. They can pass all the PowerPoints along to you. And gosh, have I forgotten anything? I don't think so, except to say thank you for your attention. It's been good to be with you.